everybody. Sam Burgin here, digital analytics lead at Verndale, coming to you today from Minneapolis to discuss some of the exciting developments within the web analytics space. We're coming off of a really exciting summer. It's been a lot of work, but it's been a lot of fun too. We've helped a lot of folks migrate over from Universal Analytics to the new version of Google Analytics, GA4. We've also even explored some alternatives for organizations that have decided to pursue analytics opportunities outside of the Google ecosystem. I wanted to take a step back today, though, and lay the groundwork, establish a framework for what exactly we're talking about when we talk about web analytics. So, what are digital analytics exactly? Well, digital analytics is a process. It's a process of collecting and analyzing data from digital sources, including websites, mobile applications, social media, online advertising campaign, organic search. An entire ecosystem of data is available to us. We use tools and techniques to measure and evaluate that data. We're looking at user behavior. We want to identify patterns and trends to gain some insights into how our digital assets are performing. Essentially, digital analytics is about understanding how our users interact with digital content and then using that information to optimize and improve our digital experiences. Now, I often hear folks when they're referring to analytics, they actually use the term metrics. Metrics and analytics are often confused and they aren't necessarily the same thing. So, what are metrics? Metrics are numerical measurements, and they're used to quantify and track specific aspects of performance or behavior. Metrics are straightforward, easily measurable, and can be expressed in terms of a single number or ratio. They're often used to monitor our progress towards our goals and identify areas for improvement. When we talk about analytics, we really are talking about a holistic process with this data, right? We're using that data and using statistical analysis techniques to extract insights and meaning from those metrics. Analytics is typically focused on answering specific questions or solving specific problems, and it involves the use of various tools, methods, and technologies to gain information from data and turn that information into actionable insights that we can use to optimize and improve our performance. So I often refer to the DIKW framework, right? The goal with the DIKW framework is to understand how we turn data into what I call wisdom. Those are our action items. So here's a real world example from here in Minneapolis, where, as you probably know, 8 to 10 months out of the year, it's cold and snowy. So a data point is when I look out my window and I see that there's snow on the ground covering the street. By itself, though, that data doesn't tell me a whole lot because there's always snow in Minneapolis. So I might pull out my iPhone in that situation and check to see what the wind is like and what the temperature is. Well, if I check my iPhone and I see that there's snow on the street, the wind is out of the northwest at 20 miles an hour, and the air temperature is about 0 degrees, it's a cold day. I have knowledge that I've gained from living in the upper Midwest for 12 years. That wind chill, it's painful. And the wind chill is going to be pretty darn low when it's that cold and that windy. In fact, it's going to be about 22 degrees below zero. I also know that my skin will freeze in 10 minutes. So, using the data I collected, adding some additional information, some additional context to it, and some prior knowledge from my lived experience, I get an actionable insight. I get some wisdom that if I'm going to walk down the street to my local bodega to grab a sandwich, I probably need to wear a hat and gloves when it's that cold and that windy. This is an example of taking data that by itself maybe doesn't always tell us the full story, adding in additional information, and coming up with a truly actionable insight that we can use to improve and optimize our performance. Now, within Google Analytics, and this is true of some of the other analytics tools you would use as well, things like Matomo and Piwik Pro, we organize data into dimensions and metrics. So dimensions are attributes of user behavior. These are qualitative, categorical attributes that we use to help describe and segment out some of those metrics. Examples of dimensions in Google Analytics that you may be familiar with include the source of your traffic, whether it's organic search, social media, or direct, the location of your users, what type of device they're using, and the titles of the pages or screens that they view. Metrics, on the other hand, like we discussed, those are going to be the quantitative measurements that represent specific aspects of user behavior. So some metrics you've probably heard about from Google Analytics include active users, views or page views, the engagement rate, and the conversion rate. And it's when we put those dimensions and metrics together that we start to begin to see information coming from Google Analytics. So another really important concept when discussing web analytics is precision versus accuracy. Something that I tell a lot of my clients is that unfortunately, the reality is that Google Analytics is not QuickBooks for your website. It's not 100% accurate, and it probably never will be 100% accurate. If you had a job where you're first in college, so let's say it was a marketing internship, and you went to trade shows and you stood at the trade show booth and you had a counter, and you quantified that your visitor metric for that day of the trade show was 250 people, you may be under the impression that Google Analytics is going to work the same way. The reality is it doesn't. Instead, though, we can target high precision. Precision refers to how consistent or reproducible a measurement is. Um, it refers to the degree of agreement among repeated measurements of the same quantity. Accuracy refers to how close a measured value is to the true value. In other words, accuracy is going to look at how well a measurement represents the actual value being measured. And measurements can be accurate even if they're not precise, and vice versa. As a digital analytics lead, I personally really prioritize precision over accuracy. To be clear, I want my data to be as accurate as possible, but I know that that's not realistic all the time and that there's going to be a ceiling. I tend to think of Google Analytics as collecting a sample of my population. What I mean by that is if I have in reality 10,000 users a week on my website, let's say that only 5,000 of them consent to cookies, aren't using an ad blocker, I'm able to track them in Google Analytics. I would consider that 5,000 person sample to be my sample of my larger population, and I can still get some insights out of that information. The trick is that I want that sample to be as consistent from week to week as possible. What I don't want to have happen is week 1 of the month, I track 2,500 of my visitors. Week 2, it goes up to 7,500. Week 3, it's 5,000. Week 4, it's all 10,000. That's not very precise. And it becomes very difficult to, with any degree of certainty or confidence, make decisions based on that imprecise data because my sample size is constantly changing. So I always counsel people, if we have a choice between precision and accuracy, as much as we want to strive for both, and we do strive for both, but at the end of the day, if we have to make that choice, I'm going to choose precision every day of the week. All of this comes into talking about data fidelity, right? This is a topic that I'm extremely passionate about. It is so important to make sure that we are delivering high fidelity, high quality data to our stakeholders. So fidelity refers to the overall accuracy and reliability or precision of our data. We don't want to have inaccurate or unreliable data for a lot of reasons, mostly because it's going to lead to incorrect conclusions and wasted resources and poor decision making. It's reliable, precise data that helps website owners make those informed decisions and improve their website's performance. To ensure data fidelity, it's important to properly configure your digital analytics tools, regularly review and verify the data, and minimize errors in data collection. A good way we can do this is maybe you're on a monthly code release schedule. Every third Saturday of the month, you do a code release. Make a point on your calendar to put 15 minutes Monday morning just to go in, open up preview mode, debug mode in Google Tag Manager or whatever tagging solution you might be using on your site. Just check and make sure all your tags are firing. Often we see that certain tags might break because page code changed. It's part of our code release schedule. That's completely normal. We want to catch those errors and fix them as quickly as possible. There is no worse feeling. Trust me on this. There is no worse feeling than when you're trying to pull a report for somebody and you check and you find out you don't have data available for the past month. Get ahead of those errors. It will save you headaches down the line. Right. So another thing that folks need to remember is that our data has a life cycle. So this is something that we work with clients at Verndale through an entire data life cycle. The first thing we do as part of a data management plan is to sit down and plan out what data we need, decide how we're going to manage it, who's going to be responsible for it, and how we're going to collect it. Once we have a plan in place, we capture the data. So this is where we're going to use a tool like Google Tag Manager to set up those custom tags, go in, set up those up on our website, test them. Now we're able to finally capture our data. We have to maintain our data. That's what I was just referring to, going through, making sure that your tags are firing as expected on a monthly or quarterly basis. Then the fun part comes. We get to analyze our data. We can use data to solve problems, make decisions, and support our business goals. We want to archive the data, so keeping relevant data for long-term use and future reference. But the reality is that data has a life cycle and data dies. Eventually, it reaches the end of its useful life. That's when we need to destroy data. So we're going to remove data from storage, delete any shared copies of that data, get ourselves ready to collect new data in its place. So how long do you want to retain your analytics data? This kind of relates to this idea of the principle of timeliness of data. So data is most valuable when the event that it is trying to reflect actually happens, right? Ideally, you're able to make decisions based off of very fresh data that was collected that very hour. We don't live in an ideal world. Most of the time, there's going to be a little bit of a lag time. So we see that in the time to action on this chart. It's in my x-axis there, right? The longer we go from when the event actually happened to when we capture, analyze, and take action, the value of our data is slowly decaying. Recall our DIKW framework. Our goal is to turn data into information, knowledge, and wisdom. The further we are from the point in time our data references, the less informational value it has to us. On the other hand, access to historical data is critical for marketers who want to compare current performance to previous performance. There are also, we should note, there can be compliance implications to keeping data. So always check with your in-house counsel, your in-house compliance folks, to find out if your data is subject to any laws relating to its retention or any internal policy your organization may have. All right, so let's talk about Google Analytics. Yep, we changed over from Universal Analytics over to GA4 on July 1st. This deadline was very well advertised. I have been excited about GA4 since it was announced. Look, it's a new product, and there are going to be some growing pains for everybody. But I personally, I love to embrace change. I love to embrace new things. So I'm coming into this with a lot of enthusiasm. There are still things that I want to see done differently in GA4, but we're seeing Google respond to user feedback, make improvements to the tool. And I think if folks keep an open mind and try to get a little bit excited about it, they're going to come around and see that GA4 is an advancement and it gives us a lot of value locked into our data and insights. All right, so when we talk about Google Analytics, we have to talk about the anatomy of an analytics stack. This is the tech stack that we are using to actually collect our data. So oftentimes it starts with Google Tag Manager. That's the tool that we use here at Verndale to instantiate or implement Google Analytics on websites. It's a really nifty tool. If we did not have Google Tag Manager, I would have to ask a web developer every time I wanted to install GA or create a new custom event. I would have to ask a web developer to manually code that onto our website. With Google Tag Manager, we insert the container, and I, as a digital marketing analyst, can use a visual interface to create these custom tags, no coding required. So we install Google Tag Manager on our website. That's what's actually listening for and collecting our data as a user browses through our website. And then we send that data up into Google Analytics, where it is stored, processed, and we can even visualize it as well. I often, though, make use of Looker Data Studio. That's the new brand name for Google's data visualization product. It was previously just called Google Data Studio. Looker Data Studio is really powerful in conjunction with GA4. It lets us create beautiful charts and graphs. We can even create dashboards that allow stakeholders to interact with their data on a real-time basis. Google Analytics does have the ability to help us visualize and analyze our data, but I'm finding it's a little bit more efficient just to bring that data into Looker Data Studio where I can have my hands on it and manipulate it right there. So how does Google Analytics collect data exactly? We're going to use a JavaScript tracking code. That's a coding language that is ubiquitous on the internet. It's placed on the website or the mobile app, and using a first-party cookie, the JavaScript code helps us collect information about user behavior on our site. This tracking code sends that data up into the Google Analytics servers, And that's going to include information like the user's IP address, what browser they're using, their device type, pages or screens viewed. Thankfully, IP address is anonymized in GA4, so we don't have to worry about violating user privacy that way. Basically, Google Analytics is serving a couple different functions here. Not only is it storing our data, it's processing that data, it's also helping us analyze the data right within the user interface and, like I said, create some basic visualizations. GA4 supports a lot of customization, including event tracking, e-commerce tracking, custom dimensions and metrics to collect more detailed data about user behavior. Ultimately, all of this data is processed and stored on Google servers, where it can be accessed through that GA interface or via an API connection to Looker Data Studio or another data visualization tool like Power BI. So welcome to the future, GA4. Why is GA4 happening right now? Why did Google push this product out? The reality is that the privacy landscape has changed. Users have new expectations about privacy, and we're even starting to see certain governments catch up and create legislation that enforces some of these privacy standards. So we expect that cookies, those are those tools that we're using to actually capture our data, those are going to become scarcer over time due to changes in the platforms and new laws and regulations. I foresee that we're going to start relying on more of a confluence of solutions, such as anonymized IP data, modeling, and aggregated measurement, in order to get an idea of how our websites are performing. Remember, Google Analytics is not QuickBooks for your website. I'm trying to get folks to understand that we need to move away from thinking that any analytics platform is going to tell us exactly how many people are on our websites. It's really not what you use Google Analytics for. Instead, what you use Google Analytics for is to understand attribution. How do your users get to your website? What percentage come from organic search versus social media versus direct traffic? How are users navigating through the website? I think the most powerful metrics in GA4, they're not absolute numbers, they're percentages, right? Percentages make me really excited, and I try to express as many metrics and percentages as I can. What are the differences between GA4? Universal Analytics relied on a session-based data model. In GA4, this is an event-based data model. So you're probably familiar with the concept of a session. That's when I log onto your website and view a certain number of pages within a set period of time. Don't worry, GA4 still has sessions, it still reports that metric, but it's not the basis of our data model. Instead, our data is modeled across all the events that are happening on our website. Universal Analytics had a pretty inflexible interface. GA4 is highly customizable. It's designed to be flexible. It's designed to allow businesses to create the customer reports and dashboards they need to monitor their progress. One thing that makes me really excited about GA4 is the ability within custom explorations to examine metrics from multiple dimensions, right? So previously in Universal Analytics, we could really only look at 2 dimensions at a time for each metric. In GA4, using custom explorations, we can do 5, 10. The sky is really the limit there, especially when you bring in a tool like Looker Data Studio or you export your data into BigQuery. Finally, Universal Analytics was entirely reliant on cookies. GA4 is designed with the future in mind. To be clear, it still requires cookies right now to function, but it's designed to be cookie less, not cookie less, cookie less. Machine learning is said to be able to fill in some of the gaps in data from users who decline cookies, helping us to hopefully have an accurate view of at least our conversions, even if we have users who are declining and not accepting our analytics cookies. Some other changes, user ID tracking. This feature was available in Universal Analytics, but it was kind of cumbersome to implement. In GA4, it's extremely easy to implement. I really encourage folks, if you have user logins on your website, go ahead and add in this feature. It just requires a little bit of page code changes that we're capturing an anonymized version of your users' usernames. But having access and being able to segment our event data out so that we can see the differences in behavior between authenticated and non-authenticated users is huge and really worthwhile. GA4 has higher data collection limits. Basically, we're able to collect more events and more parameters. Parameters are the technical term we use to kind of describe the information that's feeding us those dimensions, right? So a parameter is kind of those categorical attributes that we add onto our event tags to give them additional context. GA4 also allows for a little bit more granular data control. It is designed to be a privacy-focused solution. It's also kind of geared towards, better compliance, better understanding of what data we have about our users, better understanding of how we store that data, and ultimately better control over the destruction of that data. Again, as a reminder, always consult your in-house legal team or compliance folks to understand your obligations related to managing user data and how GA4 fits into that picture, if at all. Overall, I think that GA4, its approach to data collection is more flexible, it's more customizable compared to Universal Analytics, and it allows for more precise tracking of user behavior across devices and platforms. This flexibility requires more manual configuration, though, and it's not always going to be suitable for all use cases. What events does GA4 collect? The sky's the limit here. Again, there are some automatically collected events such as page views, session start, first visit. Then we have a group of events that we're calling enhanced measurement events. These are things like outbound link clicks, site search, video engagement, types of data that I used to have to manually tag in Google Tag Manager that are now being collected out of the box using enhanced measurement with GA4. Sometimes I experiment. I use both. I might have my own custom site search tag, but I also compare that data to what the built-in enhanced measurement data shows me in GA4. Totally okay. You may decide that you prefer one over the other, in which case you can modify your data collection. There are recommended events. So if you are, for example, collecting e-commerce data, Google actually gives us that schema. So it's pretty easy for us to implement e-commerce tracking in GA4. And if you follow the schema from Google to the letter, you're gonna have some very beautiful monetization reports in GA4 that I think far eclipse anything that was available to us in UA. For e-commerce, GA4 is a great solution. Finally, we can always create custom events. So a really common example of these are navigation menus. Folks want to know and understand kind of at an aggregated level, how are users navigating through my website? We can create some custom event tags in GTM that help us to understand how are folks using our navigation menu. It's really exciting. I love creating custom events for folks using GTM. Things that we've advised folks to consider about migration considerations. There are some new metrics in GA4, and not all metrics are like for like. So bounce rate is a big one. Originally, bounce rate was retired in favor of a new metric called engagement rate. And engagement rate is calculated very differently than how a bounce was in Universal Analytics. Now, this is something that I don't really like about GA4. I want to talk to you about because I don't want you to look at bounce rate anymore. Here's why. They brought back bounce rate because folks protested. We said, hey, you can't take away my bounce rate. I don't want to use this engagement rate. So they brought back bounce rate. Challenge is that they're not calculating bounce rate in GA4 the same way they were with Universal Analytics. So in GA4, bounce rate is simply the inverse of the engagement rate. Okay, so Sam, what's the engagement rate? Great question. Engagement rate is basically the ratio of sessions that are considered engaged over the ratio of total sessions. So, if I have 7,500 sessions that are considered engaged and I have 10,000 total sessions, my engagement rate is 75% that day. An engaged session, according to GA4, lasts longer than 10 seconds and or views more than one page or screen and or completes a conversion action. Whereas bounce rate was, basically they landed on the page and didn't click anything else. So, I'm cautioning folks against trying to compare the bounce rate that they have in their historical UA data against the bounce rate they have for GA4 because they're just not exactly the same metric. It's a little bit dangerous. I don't like how Google has labeled this, but I'm warning you now so you can avoid making that mistake. A couple other changes in GA4 that folks need to consider: the lack of views. So we had some folks who may have been using views within a Universal Analytics property to disaggregate their data from international sites. For example, those views are no longer available in GA4. Dashboards and data visualization, all of those tools need to be updated to map to the new event schema in GA4. Finally, there are some new attribution models, and in fact, Google has been changing the attribution models. Be careful with that data, especially as you're comparing it to Universal Analytics. I still consider the data in GA4 to be reliable. I very much value this data. I think it's an improvement. I just want folks to understand, though, that GA4 is not just a reskin of Universal Analytics. It truly is a new tool from the ground up. And there's always going to be value, I think, in comparing to some of your historical Universal Analytics data. But you got to understand it's going to be an apples to oranges comparison. They're just not the same data sets. There are some data warehousing needs that folks need to consider too. So if you want to preserve your historical Universal Analytics data, as of today, that is still available in Universal Analytics, but Google has told us to expect it to go away by July 1, 2024. That means that folks who want to maintain and keep their historical UA data have about a year to decide how they're going to do that. This can take many forms. You may simply decide to export some top level PDFs, tuck them away in a file folder, maybe a SharePoint drive, maybe a Google Drive, and I hope you look at them if you took them. You might do a more complex integration. You could do a data warehousing solution where you're hooking up Universal Analytics to BigQuery. That's going to be really useful for folks who anticipate a need to run new queries against their raw data set. In the middle, there's a connector that allows us to actually hook up Universal Analytics into Google Sheets. That's Google's Excel product, or sorry, spreadsheet product. That we can set those connectors to actually refresh on a recurring basis, and we can also customize what dimensions and metrics we use on those Google Sheets. That's kind of the middle ground option. I think that's the right option for a lot of folks. Long term in GA4, though, we're going to need to have a conversation about data retention. So, with Universal Analytics, data was basically retained almost indefinitely. With GA4, our aggregated data is supposedly going to be retained indefinitely. But if you're using those powerful custom explorations to run specific queries, you're limited to two data retention settings, 2 months or 14 months. This is another area where you need to check with your in-house legal or compliance folks to see which option is best for you. But you need to understand that, comparing year-over-year performance in GA4 is going to be a little bit difficult when we start using those custom explorations because we won't be able to look back past 15 months. If you do anticipate that need, this is where you're going to probably want to, again, pursue some kind of data warehousing solution after checking with your IT folks, after checking with your legal folks to find out, how best to handle that in your organization. But if you're using those custom explorations, which I think GA4 is really kind of steering us towards, those custom explorations only look back 14 months. That means we need to have a plan for long-term data storage. All right, now user privacy is something we have to talk about, but I cannot say this enough. I cannot emphasize this enough. Check with your in-house legal team, check with your in-house compliance folks, have the conversation to understand what are your obligations to your users, your legal obligations, your internal policies. Make sure that you're engaging the right folks when it comes to digital analytics and privacy. So what's happening here is that, we have seen a really big change in how user consent factors into the equation. So previously, the early days of the internet, I think that a lot of us users made that Faustian bargain that, hey, I'm going to give you my data, I'm going to let you monetize it. I just want to access your website for free. Well, there have been a couple scandals, unfortunately. I think we're a lot more attuned to how companies are monetizing and using our data. And we're seeing laws and regulations catch up to that. So now there's a new requirement to collect affirmative consent. Basically, marketers need to not only inform their users that they're going to be collecting this data, but they're going to have to get their users to agree to have that data collected. And what we're seeing is about half of users tend to decline cookies. They say, no, actually, I do not consent to you putting a cookie on my machine. I do not consent to you to collecting, data about how I'm behaving on your website. I don't consent to monetizing that data. And, as companies, we need to respect that, right? We want to respect our customers' wishes. We want to respect customers' privacy. This is where I come back to the fact that Google Analytics is not an accounting system. It's not QuickBooks for your website, right? Ultimately, Google Analytics is great at what it does, which is collecting a sample of our users who agree to be part of our sample and giving us information about that sample that we can then apply insights to the entire population. So when we think about analytics and privacy, two of the biggest laws that I want you to be familiar with are the GDPR and the CPRA. Basically, the GDPR is the European privacy law that was introduced in 2018. The CPRA actually builds and supersedes upon a previously existing law, the CCPA. CPRA, though, adds in an enforcement mechanism. There's now a regulatory body with the power to issue fines to companies that don't follow California law if they do business in California, if they have customers in California. You can be fined if you're not following the CPRA and the CCPA. So again, check with your in-house legal team. Check with your compliance people. Understand, okay, based on where we do business and who our customers are, what are our requirements and what are the ramifications if we don't accurately respect user privacy and respect the laws of where we're doing business. Ultimately, we're driving towards a cookie-less future. Will it ever be truly cookie-less? I don't know. That's why I say it's cookie-less. We're going to see fewer cookies, I can tell you that much. So Google has previously announced it's phasing out support for third-party cookies. Those are cookies created by a domain other than what the user is visiting in Google Chrome by 2024. They have extended that deadline several times now. So what actually happened next year, I don't know. I have my doubts, but we're driving towards that direction. Apple actually already enforces a 7-day expiry for first-party cookies on the iPhone. So those are the first-party cookies. Those are the cookies that are created by a website that a user is actually visiting. If a customer doesn't return to the website within that 7-day time frame, Apple wipes the cookies out of the iOS system. That means that the user comes back and they need a new cookie. That actually has big implications when you're looking at your new users metric, by the way, in GA4. I like to remind folks that those user metrics, those aren't legal persons with souls. Users are devices. Right now, we really only have the technology to track specific devices. If cookie expires on an iPhone, though, Google's reading that cookie to populate that new users metric. If the cookie expires, that means that that person could be counted as a new user, even though they were just on your website 8 days ago. But because their cookie expired, they still count as a new user. Doesn't mean to completely ignore that metric, doesn't mean that it has no value. I just like to tell folks, hey, be aware there are a couple nuances here and how this metric actually works. All right, so GA4 doesn't rely on third-party cookies. That's the good news, but it still requires user consent to first-party cookies to track most users. It does support user ID tracking, like I was discussing. I really encourage you to look into that solution if it's appropriate for your business, but you have to make sure that you anonymize user IDs. So if you're using, for example, email addresses as the user ID, you cannot pass user email addresses into GA4. That is a huge privacy violation. Don't do it. This space and legislation are going to continue to evolve. We are monitoring this at Verndale. We're trying to understand the implications for our clients, and we'll let you know, as we see the importance of cookies decline, we'll let you know what tracking technology will replace those cookies and how best marketers can leverage it to, still gain actionable insights about their websites, but also respect user privacy. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. That's my little mini lecture on web analytics and GA4. I hope you learned some cool things. I hope you're as excited about this new tool as I am. I'll talk to you again soon. Have a great weekend. Take care, folks.